The Civil War was one of the deadliest wars in American history, fought between the North, the Union, and South, the Confederacy. This war lasted from 1861 to 1865. Before the war began, the South formed the Confederacy because of lack of support from the government. The Southern economy was very reliant on slavery, and because of Lincoln's election, the South had thought that Lincoln would ban slavery and decided to secede. Soldiers who fought for the U.S. now had to make a decision to fight for the North, the Union, or the South, the Confederacy. This impacted lives of the soldiers who fought in the Civil War.
The Union. The Union was the North of the United States, which was consisted of 20 free states. This meant no slaves could be held here. The Union had fought the Civil War against the Confederates, who were the South, who believed slavery should be kept and made legal. States in the South were able to hold slaves and own them as they were slave states, not free states. During the war, many slaves had fled from the South and fought for the North. The North made it legal for slaves to fight for them. Most slaves were sent into battle to become soldiers or to become workers. If you were a slave soldier, you would be in the front lines of dangerous battles as people did not respect them as much as wasted the time. If you were a worker, you would help prepare food for the soldiers, make clothing, or set up shelter for soldiers. In the war, there were many people who had become soldiers. About 2,600,000 soldiers participated in the Union side. Because of the big number of soldiers in the war, there was also a big amount of casualties and injuries. About 360,000 soldiers had died in the Union side in the Civil War. 110,000 soldiers died from the battle, and about 250,000 had died from disease. Most of the soldiers in the Union were not as skilled as soldiers in the Confederacy, but they did have more men in their army. This had meant the Union had an advantage number-wise, but had a disadvantage skill-wise. Compared to skill and number, it appeared that number was more dominant in this war looking at the outcome. This was the Union in the Civil War.
The Confederate Army. The Confederate Army included the southern states. It was originally formed by 7 slave states in the region of the U.S., whose economy was mostly dependent upon agriculture. In the Confederacy, most soldiers were in their mid-20s and were more experienced than Union soldiers. An estimate of soldiers in the Confederate Army ranged from 750,000 men to 1 million men. Most soldiers were volunteers who fought for what they believed in. During the war, slaves had also helped the Confederate Army. Most of the African Americans in the war were slaves brought by their masters who helped tend their armies. They would help with serving the food and preparing army camps. If a slave's master was killed in battle or died from diseases and injuries, he or she would be returned to the master's family. Over 10,000 African American slaves have fought for the Confederate Army because they wanted to or were forced to. Some of the slaves in border states also fought for the Union. During the middle of the war, when the Confederate needed reinforcement troops, militia sent in African slaves to fight with the Confederates. Although many African American slaves fought for the Union and the Confederacy, they were still treated harshly. This caused African American slaves to escape and fight for freedom. Racism continued throughout the war, and Africans were still considered minorities.
African American Soldiers. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on the first day of 1863. This allowed slaves to be free and join the Union. This would also allow the slaves to have their own life and get their own jobs, such as being a soldier. This only belonged to the seceded states, also known as the South, or Confederacy. It did not free all slaves, but raised the hopes of many. This also showed that the Union Army and Navy accepted the Africans as human beings. Basically, this allowed all the slaves to do whatever they want, but only in the South. African soldiers had a key role in the Civil War. The Africans were basically giving away their lives for a country they were forced into. This was really unexpected. At first, Lincoln was hesitant to free the slaves and let them join the Union, because he didn't want the border states to secede, and he didn't want to seem desperate. The soldiers were bravest especially in the 54th Infantry. These Africans might have even changed the result of the Civil War.
Life in camp. Volunteer soldiers during the Civil War were unaware that most of the time they'd be in military camps. If the volunteers were going to die, they wanted it to be at a heroic level, but then they met the harsh conditions of the disease-filled camps. Around 1,264,000 soldiers lost their lives in the Civil War, and half of these deaths were due to sickness from camp conditions. The men who wanted to save the Union or secure their liberty died on a less grander stage than they had previously thought. Poor shelter proved to be fatal in colder seasons. Hazardous meals and lack of hygiene killed many in the Civil War. The soldiers' lives weren't very glamorous either. Gambling and music kept the soldiers occupied, but nothing helped like a victory in battle.